September 14th, 1945. Crystal City, Texas. The rifle was heavier than it looked. A dark walnut stock, cold steel barrel, the kind of weight that pulled at the shoulder even before it was lifted. Dust hung in the air as the cowboys stood in a loose half-circle, hats low, hands nowhere near their holsters. Across from them, a line of Japanese women froze where they stood bare hands, thin sleeves, eyes locked on the weapon being passed forward. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as powerful as we hope, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back to life. Someone translated softly. Someone else shook their head, certain they'd misunderstood. A woman near the back clutched her blanket tighter, the wool scraping against her cracked fingers. Another swallowed hard, staring at the rifle's sling as it creaked against leather. They had been warned about Americans, about cruelty, about humiliation, about execution. But no one had warned them about this. The words had already been said, the decision already made, and now the rifle was changing hands. In that moment, as fingers wrapped around cold steel for the first time, everything they believed about surrender, about captivity, about the enemy shattered. The war had ended 29 days earlier. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio waves throughout Japan, speaking publicly for the first time in history. His words were formal, archaic, wrapped in classical Japanese that many citizens struggled to understand. But the meaning was clear enough. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For the Japanese civilian internees scattered across America, over 110,000 people, imprisoned in camps from California to Arkansas, the end of the war brought not relief, but terror. They had lived for years behind barbed wire, branded as enemy aliens despite many being American citizens. They had heard the propaganda, absorbed the fear. Now, with Japan defeated and humiliated, what would their captors do? In Crystal City, Texas, the largest family internment camp in America, 3,374 internees, Japanese, German, and Italian families, waited in a kind of paralyzed dread. The camp sat on 290 acres of former farmland, surrounded by chain-link fences and guard towers. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Dust storms turned the sky orange. And now, with the war over, the future was more uncertain than ever. The Japanese women in particular carried a specific fear, one rooted in training that had begun years before. During the war, Japanese schoolgirls had been taught to use bamboo spears, to fight with sharpened sticks, to die rather than face capture. Government propaganda films showed Americans as brutal savages who raped and murdered civilians. Women's groups had been organized into neighborhood associations, drilled in basic combat, told that death was preferable to surrender. One woman, Keiko Matsumoto, had attended these drills in Osaka before her family emigrated to California in 1939. She remembered the instructor's voice, sharp and unyielding. If the enemy comes, you will not be taken alive. You will not dishonor your family or your emperor. When the FBI arrested her father in early 1942, rounding up community leaders as potential threats, Keiko had believed the warnings were true. Now, at 23, standing in a Texas internment camp with the war lost, those lessons felt like prophecy. The women watched the guards carefully. They noticed when routines changed, when new personnel arrived, when supplies were counted or buildings inspected. Every shift felt like a prelude to something worse. At night they slept lightly, always listening. The sound of boots on gravel sent hearts racing. A knock on the door meant catastrophe. Then the announcement came. A work detail was being formed. Japanese women would be assigned to a nearby ranch to assist with agricultural labor. Transportation would be provided. Participation was mandatory. The words landed like stones in still water. Ranch work, cowboys, open land. No explanation of what assist meant. No guarantee of return. The women gathered in small groups, speaking in whispers, trying to decode the message. Was this how it would happen? Would they be taken out into the desert, one group at a time, and simply disappeared? On September 14th, a truck arrived at dawn. 8 women were called. Keiko was among them. The ranch belonged to the Dawson family, who had worked this land for 3 generations. Cattle, chickens, a small vegetable operation supplying nearby towns. The war had taken their sons, one to Europe, one to the Pacific, and labor had become scarce. When the government offered internee workers as part of a new rehabilitation program, Tom Dawson, the patriarch, had agreed. Not out of sympathy, but out of necessity. The truck rumbled down a dirt road, kicking up dust that coated everything. The women sat in the bed, holding on to the sides, their faces blank. Keiko kept her eyes on the horizon. Open land, no fences. If this was an execution site, it was the most exposed one imaginable. They arrived mid-morning. The ranch was spare barn, corral, a few outbuildings, a main house sitting low against the flat landscape. The sun was already fierce. Tom Dawson stood near the barn, a tall man in his 60s, weathered by decades of sun and wind. 2 other men flanked him, younger, broader, their hats pulled low. No one spoke. The women climbed down from the truck, boots hitting dirt. They formed an instinctive line, shoulders tight, eyes forward. Years of training, different training now, but training nonetheless, made them stand at attention without being told. Tom gestured toward the barn. The women followed. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with the smell of hay and oil. And there, mounted on the wall, was the rifle. A Winchester Model 1894, lever action, .30 to .30 caliber. The walnut stock gleamed where hands had polished it smooth over years of use. The barrel caught the light, sharp and clean. Keiko's breath stopped. The others saw it, too. One woman's hand flew to her mouth. Another took a half-step back. The rifle wasn't pointed at them. It wasn't being held. It was simply there, displayed, accessible, unmistakable. Tom said something in English. One of the younger men, a ranch hand named Bill, repeated it slower. "You'll be working with the animals, feeding, cleaning, egg collection." His accent was thick, the words unfamiliar, but the rifle required no translation. The women understood immediately. This was the threat. The weapon they would face if they resisted, if they ran, if they failed to comply. It hung there like a promise, a reminder of who held power. The lesson was clear. Obey or face the consequences. They were given buckets, grain sacks, simple tools. The work began in silence. Days passed. The routine settled into a rhythm: arrive at dawn, work until dusk, return to the camp. The rifle remained on the wall, untouched but always visible. Every time they entered the barn, eyes found it first. Every time they passed beneath it, shoulders tensed. But something was wrong. The threat never materialized. No one grabbed the rifle. No one made demands. The cowboys worked alongside them, demonstrating tasks, correcting mistakes with gestures rather than shouts. When one woman stumbled carrying a heavy feed sack, Tom himself stepped forward and took half the weight, nodding toward the trough. Keiko watched carefully. She had been trained to recognize deception, to expect cruelty disguised as kindness. But the days accumulated, and the pattern held. The rifle stayed on the wall. The work continued. The cowboys remained distant, but not hostile. Then one morning the rack had been lowered. Not dramatically, just a few inches. Enough that the rifle now hung at shoulder height instead of above their heads. Keiko noticed immediately. So did the others. They exchanged glances, confused. Was this escalation? Preparation? The work continued. Another day, another adjustment. The rifle dropped lower still. Now it hung at arm's reach, the sling close enough to brush against their sleeves as they passed. The proximity was suffocating. Every trip through the barn became a test of nerve. Don't look, don't react. Keep moving. But still, no one touched it. The cowboys didn't guard it. They didn't lock it away. They simply left it there, closer each day, as if inviting something neither side could name. On the fifth day, a coyote appeared near the chicken coop. The hens erupted in panic, feathers exploding into the air. The women scattered, backing away from the predator's low growl. Keiko's heart hammered. She looked toward the barn. The rifle was 10 steps away. The cowboys stood motionless, watching, not intervening. The coyote crept closer, ribs showing through its patchy fur, eyes locked on the terrified chickens. One hen bolted in the wrong direction, straight toward the predator. Keiko's training screamed at her, the rifle, the weapon, right there, but her hands stayed frozen at her sides. To reach for it was to invite execution. That was the trap. That was the test. Wasn't it? The coyote lunged, seized a hen. Blood and feathers. Then it turned and trotted back through the fence line, disappearing into the scrub. Tom Dawson bent down, picked up a fallen egg, and placed it back in the crate. He said nothing. The rifle remained untouched. But the silence felt different, now charged with a question no one could answer. That night, rain hammered the barn roof. The women lay in their cots, the thin blankets offering little warmth against the damp. The door creaked open. Tom entered soaked, carrying the rifle. Water dripped from the barrel. He walked past the bedrolls, without a word, and leaned the rifle against a post 3 feet from the nearest cot. Then he left. The door stayed ajar. Keiko stared at the rifle. It stood upright in the darkness, close enough to touch. The smell of gun oil filled the air, sharp and metallic. Around her the other women lay frozen, breath shallow. No one slept. No one moved. The rifle stood among them, a presence more powerful than any guard. In the morning, Tom returned and placed the rifle back on the rack. Still no explanation. Still no threat. Just a weapon, moving closer, then retreating, like a test with no clear parameters. Weeks passed. The rifle continued its strange migration, sometimes on the wall, sometimes on a crate, sometimes leaning casually against a post. The women's hands grew stronger. Calluses formed, backs straightened. The work became routine, and slowly, imperceptibly, the rifle became part of the landscape rather than the center of it. Then came the morning that changed everything. September 29th, 1945. Tom Dawson entered the barn at dawn carrying the rifle and a box of shells. The women were already awake, preparing for the day's work. He set the rifle on a wooden crate in the center of the space. The sound metal on wood echoed sharply. He opened the chamber. Empty. Snapped it closed. Then he gestured. Bill, the translator, stepped forward and spoke carefully in broken Japanese. KOJO.J. She gets the rifle. Silence, then confusion. One woman gasped. Another shook her head violently, certain she'd misheard. Bill pointed. Keiko. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. She crossed the barn, each step impossibly loud. The rifle was cold in her hands, heavier than she'd imagined. The weight pulled at her shoulders, centered in her palms. She had held training rifles before wooden mock-ups, lifeless and hollow. This was different. This was real. Tom gestured toward the door. Keiko followed, the rifle awkward across her arms. Outside, 6 tin cans sat balanced on a fence rail. Tom pointed, then stepped back. The meaning was clear. Keiko raised the rifle. Her hands remembered the training left under the stock, right near the trigger guard. She aligned the sight, squeezed. The shot cracked across the open land like thunder. Birds exploded from the eaves. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising instantly. She staggered back, eyes wide. One can spun off the rail and hit the dirt. Tom nodded. A small nod, barely more than a blink. Then he pointed to a bucket of shells on a nearby stump and walked away. Keiko stood there, the rifle still in her hands, her shoulder throbbing. Behind her, the other women had gathered at the barn door, watching in stunned silence. The rifle hadn't been a threat. It had been an assignment, protection, responsibility. Coyotes had been spotted near the property. Predators threatened the livestock. Someone needed to carry the weapon, and they had chosen her. The transformation didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded over weeks in small, cumulative shifts. Keiko carried the rifle slung across her back as she worked. At first the weight felt foreign, intrusive, but gradually it became part of her. The other women no longer flinched when they saw it. The cowboys no longer watched her carefully. The rifle simply was a tool, like the buckets and rakes and crates they carried daily. One morning in early October, Tom returned the rifle to the rack. No ceremony, no explanation. He simply lifted it, set it on the nails, and walked away. Keiko passed it minutes later, balancing a crate of eggs. Her coat sleeve brushed the barrel. She didn't flinch. She barely noticed. That was the moment the transformation completed. The physical anchor, the rifle that had once represented terror, power, control, had become ordinary. It hung on the wall, accessible, unremarkable. The women moved past it without fear, without reverence, with nothing but the quiet acknowledgment of a tool returned to its place. The Crystal City internment camp closed in early 1946. Families were released, repatriated or resettled, depending on their citizenship status and personal circumstances. Keiko Matsumoto returned to California, where she worked as a seamstress and raised 3 children. She rarely spoke about the war years. When she did, she mentioned the camp, the heat, the uncertainty. But she almost never mentioned the ranch, almost never mentioned the rifle. In 1983, a researcher interviewing former internees asked her about labor assignments during her detention. Keiko paused for a long moment, her hands still in her lap. Then she said quietly, "They gave me a rifle. I thought they were going to kill us. But they gave it to me." The researcher asked what happened next. Keiko smiled, small and distant. "I carried it, and I realized they trusted us. Or maybe they were teaching us to trust them. I still don't know which." The story of Japanese internment in America is well documented. The fear, the injustice, the constitutional violations, the families torn apart and imprisoned without trial. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated during World War II, 2/3 of them American citizens. They lost homes, businesses, entire lives. The government later acknowledged the internment as a grave injustice driven by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, offering a formal apology and reparations to surviving internees. But within that larger story are thousands of smaller moments of humanity, confusion, terror, and unexpected grace that defy simple narratives. The incident at the Dawson Ranch in Crystal City, Texas, is one such moment. It doesn't erase the injustice. It doesn't justify the camps. But it reveals something more complex than the binaries of victim and oppressor, captive and captor. Tom Dawson, by all accounts, was not a progressive thinker. He needed labor. He accepted government workers. But somewhere in that transactional arrangement, something shifted. Whether through deliberate design or instinctive decency, he and his ranch hands made a choice to offer trust before it was earned, to extend responsibility before it was requested, to place a weapon in the hands of women who had every reason to believe they would be executed. And the women trained since girlhood to fear capture, to expect brutality, to die rather than surrender, found themselves holding a rifle not as prisoners, but as partners in the work of survival. The rifle still hangs in a barn in southern Texas, though the Dawson Ranch has long since changed hands. The new owners found it years ago while clearing out the old equipment, a Winchester Model 1894. Wheel maintained, its stock still smooth, its barrel still clean. They keep it mounted near the door, a relic of a time they don't fully understand. Sometimes visitors ask about it. The current owner shrugs. "Been here forever," he says. "Guess somebody used it for varmints." But if you look closely, you can still see the faint marks on the stock's small scratches, worn smooth by hands that held it decades ago, hands that trembled, then steadied, hands that expected execution, then learned to carry weight. The rifle is just an object, wood and steel. But for a brief moment in 1945 it became something more, a test, a bridge, a fragile, unlikely anchor for trust built not through words, but through the simple, terrifying act of letting go. And in that moment on a dusty ranch in Texas, 8 women learned that surrender and trust are not the same thing, that enemies can become co-workers, that the weight of a rifle, once feared, can become bearable when carried not as a weapon of oppression, but as a tool of shared survival. They carried it, then set it down. And in doing so, they carried something heavier home, the knowledge that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are moments when people choose differently, when the expected cruelty never comes, when the rifle, against all odds, changes hands, and sometimes that changes everything.